Auschwitz, for most people, is not just a geographical name. It has long become a true symbol of all the horrors of World War II. From May 1940 to January 1945, the largest Nazi concentration camp was located here, through which about 1.1 million people passed, and about 1 million of them died. And Auschwitz was a real death conveyor, where unfortunate prisoners were sent to gas chambers, shot, and subjected to monstrous medical experiments. The overwhelming majority of those who died were Jews, which is why Auschwitz, along with Babi Yar and the Warsaw Ghetto, became one of the main symbols of the Holocaust. So today in this episode we'll talk about how its prisoners, the prisoners of Auschwitz, were kept, who ran the camp and who guarded it. You will also learn about the horrific experiments that the camp prisoners were subjected to, the situation of women and children in Auschwitz, and the resistance of the prisoners against their executioners. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How Did They Live section open. Let's start. The history of Auschwitz and its description. The Nazis began creating concentration camps almost immediately after coming to power. At first, political opponents of the regime were sent there, as well as everyone the new authorities considered undesirable elements: Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and people with mental illnesses. The Nazis explained their actions by claiming they wanted to cleanse Germany of people who did not fit the image of an ideal Aryan society. The situation changed in 1938 after the infamous Kristallnacht, when Jews began to be sent to the camps en masse. This quickly filled old concentration camps and led to new ones being built. After World War II began, Nazis set up camps in occupied countries. Soon, the number of prisoners in these camps surpassed the number of inmates in Germany and Austria. One of these camps was Auschwitz. The camp was located near the Polish city of Oświęcim, which, along with the surrounding territories, was annexed to the Third Reich in 1939. That's why the Germans called both the city and the camp Auschwitz. This is the name that is usually used internationally. In Soviet and later Russian sources, the Polish name Oświęcim appears more often, while the Poles themselves use only the German toponym to clearly separate the monstrous death camp from the ancient Polish city. Oświęcim was founded on April 27, 1940 by order of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler. In reality, it was not a single concentration camp, but a huge complex that included several facilities: Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, and Auschwitz II. The total area of the complex was over 500 hectares, and the territory was surrounded by barbed wire fences carrying high-voltage electricity. The first camp in Oświęcim was Auschwitz I, which was later converted into the administrative center of the entire complex. It was built on the basis of former army barracks and contained 24 blocks where prisoners lived. On the territory of the camp, there was actually a prison, a torture block, and even a brothel. In one of the barracks at Auschwitz I, there was also a special wall where prisoners were executed by shooting, and it has survived to this day. Initially, the camp held Poles and Jews, and later, for some time, Soviet prisoners of war were kept here. The number of prisoners gradually increased and by 1942 reached 20,000 people. The camp was guarded by SS soldiers from the Totenkopf division. Auschwitz I is sadly known for being the place where people were first killed with Zyklon B gas. During the tests, the Nazis killed several hundred Poles and Soviet prisoners of war, after which the experiment was considered successful. However, the gas chamber in the camp did not operate for long. Prisoners here were killed in other ways, through exhausting labor and meager food. Auschwitz II is the very death camp that is known around the world as Auschwitz. It is also known as Birkenau, or in Polish as Brzezinka, named after the village where it was actually located. Its construction began in October 1941 and took place in several stages. Initially, a men's and a women's camp were built, and they were put into operation in 1942. In the second section, there were several separate camps. There were gypsy, hospital, quarantine, Jewish and family camps, as well as storage and utility buildings. The construction of the second phase was completed, and in 1941 work began on the third section. Jewish women were held here who, for some reason, were not entered into the camp registration books. The fourth section of Auschwitz was never completed. Auschwitz II had 4 gas chambers where mass executions of prisoners took place, and 4 crematoria where the Nazis disposed of the bodies of those killed. It should be noted that the crematoria often couldn't handle the workload, so the bodies of the victims were burned right in pits on the campgrounds, and the gas chambers were also operating at their limit. Sometimes prisoners had to wait for 10 to 12 hours for their turn to be killed. It should be noted that Auschwitz was built not only for the mass murder of Jews and regime opponents. Its prisoners, just like those in other camps, were used by the Nazis as free labor, forcing them to do the hardest work. In May 1942, Auschwitz III began operating, a vast complex consisting of 40 campsites established directly on the grounds of factories and mines. This camp was attached to Interessengemeinschaft Farben, the largest German chemical concern. In Auschwitz III, doctors were constantly working, selecting weakened prisoners for further transport to the gas chambers. In 1944, faced with the advancing Soviet troops, the Nazis decided to cover up the traces of their crimes. They blew up the gas chambers and crematoria, destroyed documentation, and evacuated further west. About 58,000 able-bodied prisoners, exhausted inmates, were forced to march for many kilometers on foot. For thousands of them, this road became their last. At the time of the liberation of Auschwitz, about 7,000 sick people remained on its territory, including several hundred children aged 6 to 14. A horrifying scene of the Nazi death factory with crematoriums and gas chambers unfolded before the Soviet soldiers. In Auschwitz's large warehouses, there were 7 tons of hair stored, taken from the heads of about 140,000 women, and boxes filled with crushed human bones. In 1947, the Polish government initiated the creation of a museum in Auschwitz, and in 1979 the camp was included in the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization World Heritage List. Since 2006, following a United Nations General Assembly resolution, International Holocaust Remembrance Day has been observed here. Who were the prisoners of Auschwitz? It's hard to say exactly how many people passed through Auschwitz. The Nazis didn't keep records of the prisoners who were sent straight to the gas chambers, and they were the majority, about 70%. Every day, up to 10 trains arrived at the camp, each with 40 to 50 cars, and usually there were 50 to 100 people in each car. Based on this data, it can be assumed that about 1.4 to 1.5 million people could have passed through Auschwitz, of whom about 1.1 million were killed. We will probably never know the exact numbers. 9 out of 10 people who died in Auschwitz were Jews. In early 1942, the Wannsee Conference took place, where the Nazis discussed ways to implement the final solution to the Jewish question. After that, systematic extermination of the Jewish population of Europe began in Auschwitz, as well as in many other camps. In addition to Jews, Auschwitz held Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, Roma, homosexuals, criminal offenders, and members of religious sects. To indicate their category, prisoners wore triangles of specific colors on their uniforms. For example, political prisoners had red triangles, criminals had green, homosexuals had pink, and for Jews, 2 triangles formed the 6-pointed Star of David. What was it like to live as a prisoner in Auschwitz? Auschwitz was conceived as a camp for the mass, systematic killing of people. The Nazis managed to turn this place into a real death conveyor, a branch of hell on earth. Upon arriving at the camp, prisoners were immediately selected and divided into groups based on age, health, profession, and family. The first group included the sick, the elderly, children, and people with disabilities. They were sent to the gas chambers within a few hours. Sometimes up to 3/4 of the arrivals were exterminated. The selection was accompanied by heartbreaking scenes. Families were separated, and mothers had their children taken away from them. The second group consisted of able-bodied prisoners who were sent to work at various companies' enterprises. This was not an escape from death, but only a temporary reprieve. Above the entrance to Auschwitz hung the sign Arbeit macht frei, which means work leads to freedom. However, in reality, it became another form of genocide, through which the Nazis exterminated the prisoners. During the years of Auschwitz's existence, 405,000 prisoners went through forced labor, and more than 340,000 of them died from unbearable conditions, hunger, disease, or were simply executed. The third group usually included twins, dwarfs, and people with congenital abnormalities. They were sent to Dr. Mengele for various medical experiments, which I will describe in detail later. The fourth group consisted mainly of female prisoners, whom the Germans used as personal servants or for various camp tasks. I warn you that you have not come to a sanatorium, but to a German concentration camp, and there is only one way out. From the chimney. If anyone doesn't like it, they can go straight to the wire right now. If there are Jews in the transport, they are not allowed to live longer than 2 weeks. If there are priests, they can live for 1 month. The rest, 3 months. Such a speech was given to every group of prisoners by the deputy commandant of Auschwitz, Karl Fritsch. Horrible, just subtitles. And he wasn't exaggerating. Every day in the camp turned into a struggle for survival for the prisoners in absolutely unbearable conditions. Most of the prisoners in Auschwitz survived only a few weeks. Rarely did anyone manage to last even a couple of months. The Nazis regularly carried out selections, mercilessly sending weakened or sick people to the gas chambers. There were also frequent cases of suicide when prisoners, tormented to the point of losing their instinct for self-preservation, would throw themselves onto the electrified barbed wire. The lives of the prisoners were completely in the hands of the guards and overseers. A prisoner might be beaten or killed for a sideways glance or careless word. Sometimes the guards would throw bread into the crowd of prisoners for entertainment, causing a terrible crush. From time to time, the camp authorities arranged icy baths for the prisoners, increasing the death rate from colds and other illnesses. The prisoners lived in windowless barracks that offered almost no protection from the heat in summer or the cold in winter. There was no toilet. Instead, they used a bucket, and the barracks were terribly overcrowded. Each of them housed up to 500 people with only 36 wooden bunks available, so prisoners had to sleep 5 or 6 to a bed. However, the main enemy of the prisoners was hunger. Each day, every prisoner was given a bowl of watery soup made from rotten vegetables, a few hundred grams of bread, a piece of margarine, and a cup of slop that they called coffee. Because of the terrible quality of the food, the prisoners suffered from diarrhea. Weakened by malnutrition, they became easy victims of infectious diseases that spread throughout the camp. Sonderkommando members had a unique role. They removed murder victims from gas chambers and took them to the crematoria. They also pulled out gold teeth from the corpses, cut off hair from women, and sorted the belongings of the murdered. The Sonderkommando workers were fed better and had certain privileges, but periodically the Nazis would eliminate these teams entirely and replace them with new ones. The Nazis tried in every way to strip the concentration camp prisoners of their individuality. They shaved their hair, gave them identical prison uniforms, and instead of names and surnames, used numbers, which were tattooed on their left forearms. The situation was especially difficult for the children of prisoners. They did not have the skills or experience to secure a favorable position in the camp hierarchy and were not strong enough for physical labor. But at the same time, children suffered from stress much more than adults, and infants and small children had no chance of survival at all. Usually they were sent to the gas chambers immediately upon arrival at the camp, often together with their mothers. Among the prisoners, there were horrifying stories, even by Auschwitz standards, about infants being burned alive in the crematorium ovens. Jewish and Roma children had minimal chances of survival in Auschwitz. Often, even their own parents abandoned them, trying to hide their nationality. But this rarely helped, because it was almost impossible for a child to survive in a concentration camp without the help of an adult. In total, more than 230,000 children passed through Auschwitz, and when the camp was liberated, only 650 children were found there. The Angel of Death is one of the most terrifying chapters in the history of Auschwitz. These are, without a doubt, the medical experiments that the Nazis conducted on defenseless prisoners. This area in the concentration camp was overseen by Dr. Joseph Mengele, who earned the nickname Angel of Death for his cruelty. Dr. Mengele personally met the trains with prisoners arriving at Auschwitz. He decided which prisoners lived and which went to the gas chambers and selected human subjects for experiments here. It was claimed that the main goal of these monstrous experiments was to improve the treatment provided to German soldiers. The Nazis were also searching for new methods of sterilizing members of those nationalities they considered inferior. Many test subjects died during the experiments, while others were killed after the research was completed and their organs were removed for further study. New drugs were tested on the prisoners of Auschwitz, and novice doctors learned to perform surgical operations on them. Prisoners were deliberately infected with dangerous diseases such as malaria, hepatitis, and smallpox. Mengele did horrific things. For example, he dissected living infants, castrated men and boys without anesthesia, and sterilized women using X-rays. This maniac in a white coat had a particular interest in twins and dwarfs. For example, he tried to create Siamese twins by surgically joining ordinary twins. The children died in agony. Mengele tried to change the color of children's eyes by injecting them with various chemicals. It is believed that tens of thousands of people became victims of Mengele. Unfortunately, after the war, he managed to escape to South America. Attempts to capture him and bring him to justice were unsuccessful. Resistance in Auschwitz. Despite the horrific living conditions and the brutality of the regime, the prisoners of Auschwitz managed to resist the Nazis, including armed resistance and escapes. In October 1944, Sonderkommando members working in the crematorium staged an uprising, killing several SS men and blowing up a crematorium. Several of the rebels even managed to break out of the camp, but they were soon found and killed. Before their uprising, the rebels prepared statistics on the number of prisoners being killed in the concentration camp, as well as testimony about what was happening in the camp. This was the only case of an armed uprising in Auschwitz. The second form of resistance was prisoner escapes. Escaping from Auschwitz was extremely difficult. However, there was another key point. All the relatives of the escapee were immediately sent to a concentration camp, and all his barrack mates were executed as an example. Nevertheless, there are records of 802 escapes from Auschwitz, 144 of which were successful. 327 escapees were caught, and the fate of another 331 is unknown. Conclusion: Auschwitz is the most horrific symbol of crimes against humanity committed during World War II. It shows us what happens when one nation considers itself superior to others. After witnessing the horrors of the last World War, humanity should have learned and never allowed such events to happen again. Unfortunately, as the years go by, the terrible images of the past fade, and new leaders appear who tell their people about their uniqueness and being chosen by God. And from there, it's not far to new gas chambers. Goodbye, everyone.